we're going to win anyway, because demographically we'll be a majority in Northern Ireland in 40 years, because the demographics are such that the Catholics will do better than Protestants, and the division just showed that on the new census, that they are indeed creeping up. And so if we can just halt the bloodshed and maintain some sort of dialogue with these guys over time, we're going to get what we want. There'll be some sort of cantonization, a confederal approach with a lot of safeguards for the Protestants. But joining Ireland looks like a good bet, and if we can just limp along, we get there. On the other hand, David Trimble, who I know very well from the Ulster Unionist Party, might not disagree in the long run with that, but would say we need to safeguard every possible interest we can. Well, these differences are now narrowed to the point they can get in a room and actually talk about them. And for all that it breaks down, nobody talks about going against the Good Friday Agreement. The basic outline is there, which makes perfect sense. This cantonization, very loose government run from Dublin, with a lot of safeguards for the Protestants over time, and a booming economy that's tied in between Ireland, the UK, and this region. Makes perfect sense. The problem in the Middle East is, and I hope we're off the record, in a total dearth of leadership from everybody. Never have a people been as badly led as the Palestinians. It is heartbreaking. 48, 56, 67, 73, and 80, Arafat got it wrong. That's not to quote him urging his people to be thrilled when the United States was attacked by Saddam, which, by the way, didn't do him a whole lot of good in Washington. If he told me to go left, I'd go right. If he gave me a quarter, I'd be deeply suspicious. Geostrategically, he has been a disaster for his long-suffering people. On the other hand, I seriously question whether Prime Minister Sharon is serious about land for peace. We all know the deal. The deal's land for peace. The one thing the Sharon people say that sticks in my head, that's hard to argue, is, look, it's land for peace. We're giving up some land. We're not getting peace. If we don't get peace, we can't sell any deal to the Israeli public. And by the way, the Wye River Agreement of Clinton would never have passed a referendum in Israel. We can't push people beyond what they themselves can reach agreement on. We can't make the agreement. You know, I was on the plane today coming here. There was a quote in my magazine from T.E. Lawrence who said, let them do things imperfectly rather than you doing things perfectly, because it's their country, their nation, and your time is short. The reality is they must make peace together with us facilitating. Any peace we impose as a diktat, one side or the other will disavow very, very quickly when it doesn't suit them, and we'll be absolutely back where we started. Speaking bluntly, the only hope, I think, is a change in generation. I think that people like Mr. Barghouti and Mr. Dahlen are pragmatists, and I mentioned, I'll use the Irish example, Michael Collins is the relevant thing, meaning he'll cut a deal that's a non-utopian deal, and then his life won't be worth very much. But I think he's willing to do it. I know people who know Mr. Barghouti and Mr. Dahlen, and I think they're ready to cut the deal. Barghouti spent most of his adult life in Israeli jails. He speaks Hebrew, he knows the Israelis, he understands the limitations of the Palestinian situation, and then he's not prepared to sell them out, and is a hero of the First Intifada. You know, you're not going to get better than that, looking at a list. I wouldn't do better. And a lot of the people who were gathered around Rabin, the younger people, lieutenant colonels who have a very similar attitude to Rabin. We simply can't kill everyone in the Arab world. We don't want to have a forced war for the rest of our existence. It's not healthy for the state of Israel. Let's cut a deal based upon the best deal we can get from our position of strength now. That strikes me as a very hopeful beginning position from which to talk. But that's simply going to take us really limping along. I don't blame the Americans here, ultimately. Until they can cut a deal between them based on their own national interests, whether we're involved or not involved, don't flatter ourselves. The reality is they must cut the deal, not us. Now, do we need to be ready to move forward with that deal? We do. And has the Bush administration been too warm and too cold at the same time at various points? I think they have. But I also think President Clinton got it wrong by trying to force a deal to win the Nobel Peace Prize when, frankly, the Israeli public, and I'm not sure the Palestinian public either, would have accepted that deal. We can't push them too far, but we can't just sit back either. And that's the tightrope we're walking.
The debate in Washington now seems to be centered with the realist and the neocon perspective. Who represents the internationalist perspective politically, and how relevant is their belief structure right now?
Question is kind of inside baseball in Washington. And you're right to ask it. I think actually now is a really interesting time. I don't believe that we have this monolithic or static view. There are two, and we're off the record, there are two basic arguments going on in Washington that are really interesting. One is by internationalist Wilsonians as to what branch of Wilsonianism they end up espousing. Meaning, do they adopt the Clinton-Holbrooke, tougher-edged, still wanting international consensus, but not afraid to use force to further American and international norms approach? Or do they adopt more some of the things Governor Dean said, more the McGovernite approach? We're deeply suspicious of American force being used for national interests. And that's what the primaries are really out to prove. I mean, that's where whoever wins the election, how that works out within the Democratic kind of grouping, I think is fascinating. And my friends, let's remember the vote for President Bush on Iraq split right down the middle. 25 Democratic senators were with the president, 25 were against him. And that's an amazingly interesting thing. They are divided on the use of force to do this and lots of other things. And so that battle over which form of Wilsonianism, the harder edge version or the softer edge version, is really going on right now. Nobody's won yet, which is what makes it interesting. Nobody ever really wins, meaning it ebbs and it flows, but that's going on. You rightly mentioned the debate between realists and neocons, and again, as we're off the record, I will speak as a very frustrated realist. We're losing. The fact that I'm writing articles and doing TV spots on realism is a disaster. No offense to me at all. I'm not James Baker. I'm not Scowcroft. They should be the ones doing it. They're realists the same as I. They have exactly the same concerns I do. But they're loyal to Bush 1. And this is the difference. This president is more like Ronald Reagan than he is like his father. Every realist, I include myself, got that wrong. By the way, so the Wilsonians. Everybody got that wrong. And his instincts are more there. In a reshuffle, if President Bush were to win, the inside baseball in Washington at the moment would say you'd get somebody like Condi Rice at State, who would keep her eye on the Wilsonians at State, my friends, the Wilsonians at State, but they wouldn't matter. State doesn't really matter. The NSC, National Security Council, which would probably be run by Paul Wolfowitz, the Wolfman, who is the critical neocon. He's both the doer and the thinker. Paul can talk to Kagan and Kristol and the intellectuals of neoconservatism, and he can talk to people like Cheney and Rumsfeld. He, like Brzezinski, like Kissinger, does both things. That's really unique, very rare. And that's why Paul is so important, because he's so able, frankly. But if Paul gets NSC, Condi does the president's bidding at State, Rumsfeld, who isn't a neocon, but the guys under him are, stay there. Cheney isn't a neocon, but the young guys under him are. You now have neocons dominating all four of the decision-making structures there. And then as a realist, then I have to consider who I work for. So I'm pretty gloomy about that at the moment. The good news is there's bad news. The good news is like an anaconda that ate a very large rodent, the neocons are having a real hard time digesting Iraq. And the neocons don't have permanence institutionally in the same way Wilsonians and realists do. And by that I mean whoever's president, State Department tends to be Wilsonian at the basic desk level. The guys who join the State Department, either through self-selection or why you'd want to join in the first place, either way, tend to be Wilsonian. The armed services chiefs at the Defense Department tend to be realists. Whatever, whether they do that or they're inculcated with those values, they tend to be there. So they have permanence. And in Congress, both of those groups have a lot of senators and congressmen who instinctively are there. So whatever happens, they'll still be around for the next round. The neocons don't have that. They don't have that institutional permanence. They're a very small group of people at the top. And so, like a drunken gambler in Vegas, and this quote got me into trouble, they have to keep winning. And they keep doubling down. And eventually they're going to lose. I don't care where, when, how. Nobody's that good at what we do. It's an art, it's not a science. They're going to make a mistake. And if they make a mistake, we all have to clean up the mess. And that's what concerns me. But at the moment, the only way to get permanence is to be successful bureaucratically long enough to put their people in positions all the way down to the mid-levels where things get done. So that when they're out, they're still there, and the next time they can come back. If they can, they know this, by the way. They're very bright about it. If they can do this, then they've really changed American foreign policy. It's the first new school of thought, I don't know, since Woodrow at least. So that would be a big thing. On the other hand, they're not there yet. Iraq is going badly, which means guys like me can write nasty pieces on the side about them and say things about them. And I have the oddest conferences with my newfound Wilsonian friends who've discovered a common enemy. They're not there yet. And so that's really where, behind the scenes, this really does matter. How Iraq, Al-Qaeda, North Korea play out is much more important than even those really important issues, because it's going to determine, we're at the Truman stage as to where we go for really the new era. There is no yet defining principle there. And we're fighting it out like crazy. But that won't last much longer. So in a way, it's the best possible time to be alive, when everything you knew before was wrong.
I have a comment and two questions. You said before in Europe there is no foreign policy today, and coming from Europe, my comment is, I think today in Europe people don't see anymore the world divided as good and evil. There is a foreign policy, but we don't see it this way. This was my comment. And I have two questions. Do you think the American government as a mediator in the Middle East process is taking side or not? And if not, why never the American government condemns Israel in any place? And the second question is, Europe is asking for international force to go to the Middle East and separate them until we get to a peace process. And the United States always oppose this sending of international troops. So why? There is a foreign policy.
Well, there's not. It depends on which European government you talk to. If you ask about separating, and we'll use your example, separating the Arab-Israeli conflict, Palestinian Israelis, the Germans would never agree to that for obvious historical reasons. The French would entirely agree with what you're saying. The Spanish would not agree with it. The British probably would, but I'm not sure about that. The Eastern Europeans would probably have no opinion. You see the variegation of opinion. There is not a European position, generally. Where you're right is that Europeans tend to be more pro-Palestinian than the United States. And by the way, I think this is good, because we can probably leverage things better that way. Meaning, in a quartet with the United States, vaguely European positions, not the same, but variegated on that scale, the Palestinians and the Israelis, what happens? The Palestinians get a lot of their funding from the Europeans. I think that's good. I think that's good. It means they have leverage. That means that they can talk to them as the honest interlocutor, right? As the United States can with the Israelis. So if the United States and the Europeans can coordinate a position, it will be far more likely to be successful than if we all agreed on the same position. By the way, this is also true in North Korea and Iran. We can good cop, bad cop things a lot. And we actually do behind the scenes lots more than people know. Beyond the theater of all this, there's an awful lot of good cop, bad cop. And you can deal with us and soft power, big hug, or you can deal with the crazy Americans. Like Solana does that all the time to great effect. So I do think there's some coordination. Why does the United States side with Israel, to your point? Well, I turn it around. I think the poll numbers that came out from Europe this week were terrible. The number one threat the Europeans see in the world is Israel. That's the good news, because we're number 2. We're tied with North Korea and Iran, I believe. It was a very close race. But when I hear stuff like this, I think the phrase "not serious" and just shrug my shoulders. That's a nice position to hold to if you're sitting in a cafe, but that's not going to win you into negotiations with the Israelis. Forget the United States. The Israelis look at this and say, aha, this is everything we fear about Europe. And then you get back to a position where the Europeans aren't seen as an honest broker. I want the Europeans to be an honest broker. We need the Europeans to be an honest broker there. I think the Europeans mentioned that have a very strong sense of good and evil. I just don't like who they see as good and evil. This notion that the Europeans don't have a notion of cultural superiority, a critique about, say, notions of force, multilateral institutions, the role the UN should play, the role trade should play, how to manage an economy. I'm just getting going. I could continue, and that is not a philosophical point of view as well as the American point of view. Is simply not true. They are just different points of view. I'd add one other factor in, which is power. During the 18th century, when the United States was a small republic, what did it try to do? It tried to do multilateral deals with the British Navy. Well, why do you think we did that? They had all the power. The Monroe Doctrine. Who made that bold statement stick for 100 years? The American Navy? Don't waste my time. The British Navy did. We wanted to enter into any international agreement we could with a big power. As a Lilliputian, we wanted to tie Gulliver up in any way we could. That doesn't offend me. That's what small states do, or medium-sized powers do, when confronted with large powers. Right? That's perfectly normal. Okay, I'm not, like a neocon, I'm not morally outraged by that. I do the same thing. And if I'm dumb enough to fall for it, more power to the K. Okay? But let's not pretend power is not a fundamental element of what's going on here. You don't want to talk about power if you don't have any. The United States, under Alexander Hamilton, didn't talk about power. They talked about international law. Okay, why? They were a small state. come on, I've come a long way. Questions?
You talked about Europe and their military spending and their defense budgets and stuff like that. Because they're not growing in that way, that hole may not form. Do you see our foreign policy maybe taking more of a focus to the Eastern Hemisphere, like China and other countries that may develop the ability to project force beyond their own borders later on?
Well, I do, but in a bad way. I think the question is, are we going to turn to Asia because Europe isn't doing what we might like it to? You know, it depends on how you measure it, but I think no. A lot of things do matter still. Europe is easily the largest foreign direct investor in the United States, and we are in Europe. And in the age of globalization, that's what matters. Who owns what? Now, those numbers are skewed, meaning the British and the Irish are overwhelmingly the largest two. Okay, Germany, it's not equal across the board. But at least with Britain and Ireland, that's going to remain a fundamental relationship in the rest of my lifetime, because we have common habits of commerce, we have common habits with the Brits of doing business around the world, and that remains the kind of central bilateral relationship we're going to have. China, I think, will matter in the sense that it's very difficult to see our interests not lining up badly with them. The Chinese now are nationalists largely. Deng Xiaoping was kind of the watershed there, and just decided, I'm going to jump on this capitalist freight train. Why? Because it's working, and I might get back the things I want, which he largely did. I mean, it was a perfectly reasonable policy. And as a result, China's now looking at Taiwan with somewhat covetous eyes, and you wonder about China beginning to throw its weight around. China wants to be the regional power. They make that very clear. We don't really want them to be the regional power. We want us to be the regional power. So something's got to give, to quote the great Cole Porter. And I think that's the problem, that it just doesn't line up well. So I think we're going to have to spend more time thinking about that. And even worse than Europe, in Europe at least we have a multilateral series of institutions where we work together. We don't in Asia, largely I would argue because the Japanese never fessed up to World War II in the same way the Germans did. Talk to an Asian about Japanese textbooks. There's an hour-long discussion about to follow, because they simply haven't acknowledged what went on there, meaning many people in Asia still are scared spitless of the Japanese. People like the South Koreans, they're allies, come to me with dark secrets, and part of it's that their failure to do that, whereas I think the Germans' more kind of brave, open approach allow those multilateral institutions to form. Setting up bilateral institutions to deal with the Chinese is a huge problem. South Korea, for instance, on North Korea, simply wishes this problem went away, buries their head in the sand, and has anti-American demonstrations, which isn't helpful, to put it mildly, at the moment. The Japanese, again, they're economically in terrible shape. Australia is an awfully long way away, although they're the Britain of the area, they're a long way away. Don't have the people to make that work. Indonesia is barely a country. India we ought to do more with, but we have Cold War animosities to deal with. Pakistan is a total nightmare. Pakistan on Al-Qaeda, I study it, and there's my headache bottle for that. Because it just so many ways it can go wrong. I mean, you pick the one. So I think Asia, because things will go wrong, will probably be more of a point. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but I kind of agree with Ron Asmus, my buddy at the German Marshall Fund, who sees only peace and light in Europe. But Ron's right in the sense that our problems in Europe are of a different caliber, and I would agree with that. They're not about war and peace. Ron is right, though I think he didn't say it that elegantly. Yes.
Sort of a follow-up to that. Like, do you see another power like Japan, tensions growing between Japan and China? Can Japan continue to create that yen block sort of hegemony in Southeast Asia before China gets there?
No, the question was, can Japan kind of block China? No, I think India, though, playing India in is key, because what you want to do, I've never understood China scholars who say, China, talk about a place we know nothing about. When you go to a conference, you either hear they're going to challenge us in next week or they're going to fall apart, and that's on the same panel. It means none of us know what we're talking about. Just by definition, we don't know what we're talking about. China is the biggest example of none of us knowing what we're talking about. But, so, humility, saying that, I'm going to go ahead anyway, which is what they pay me the huge bucks to do. You do both. You say, we're going to try to engage China through the WTO process in a rule-based system whereby they benefit enough that they don't become a rival power, but they see the benefits of going along with the system as is. They become a status quo power. So you help them economically in every possible way you can. At the same time, you make the failure to go be a status quo power so onerous that they don't do it. And the smart play there is what? You've got the Japanese for what they're worth, which is some. You've got the South Koreans. You've got the Aussies always, as Butch to our Sundance out there. You now play in India. India is the one big state, has 1 billion people. It's a democracy. It's growing at a reasonable rate at the moment. Okay, 5 to 7%, real growth. As a balancing power. I mean, it's often been a foil to China throughout history. And without saying anything about China, the more you do with India, suddenly the Chinese military look at things and say, by God, we're surrounded by powers that are generally friendly to the United States. Maybe we don't want to go off the reservation. Maybe that's a mistake. So you do both. You try to win them over with the carrots, and at the same time, I think India is the play. And the Clinton guys got that right at the end. At the very end of the administration, when all the silly stuff was over, he finally said, well, gee, geostrategically, what should I be doing? And President Clinton, being a very bright guy, gets this right. Early Bush, too. The early Bush comments before al-Qaeda, they talked a lot about playing India in, and then, of course, that became very much secondary news. But I think in the medium term, that's exactly the play. If you play the India card, you make things much harder for the Chinese to break out from that, and we want the Chinese to make a good decision. So let's make sure they do that. Oh, come on, one for the road. Long flight home.
So talking about India, do you subscribe to the idea of like an Anglosphere?
Oh no, God. The Anglosphere. Question was, do I subscribe to the Anglosphere? I know all those guys, so the Heritage Foundation does an index of economic freedom every year that I'm kind of tangentially involved in, so I can say nice things about it because it's not really my gig. But one of the things that's very interesting when they rank openness of economies, and you can argue about the numbers and the way they rank it, but it frankly isn't very different than the Fraser Index, which is the Cato Index, or the Brookings Index. They're all relatively the same. There are a few differences, but not on this question. And last year, 8 of the freest nations were colonies of a ninth. Something's going on here. We were all colonies of the UK. We all have rule of law. We all have individual liberty. We all have transparency. We have the ability, you read like Edward III getting sued by some guy whose cow got run over and winning the suit, and Edward having to pay up. Well, that doesn't happen in the rest of the world. You're boiled in oil if you're in Uzbekistan. No, wait, that was yesterday. But it's a very different kind of way of looking at the world. Now, where the Anglosphere, I think, goes wrong is India, because it has all these other traditions in historic, or again, as a good Burkean, I believe in organic historical traditions, that also intermingle in a very different way than they do in Australia, the United States, etc. So if you look at the openness of the Indian economy, it's pretty poor, actually. I actually favor a global free trade association which would be inclusive to anybody. Just set certain standards if WTO doesn't work. Set a numerical standard, it's not negotiable, and anybody who qualifies for it's in. I don't care where you're from, I don't care what historical background you're in. You're in. If you, by free trade, you mean what I mean. And we can free up the movement of capital, we can set common accounting standards, we can lower hidden tariffs, because tariff rates are historically quite low. If we can do those 3 things, those countries would all do better. So then everybody would say, I want to join this club. So they in turn would liberalize their economies to join the club. Using the carrot by being inclusive is there. When I hear these guys, I think Cloverleaf Society, I think 1903, and by the way, I have friends who are probably members. And I think that they're onto something, that yes, if I still have inclusive, most of the countries that get involved will indeed be from this historical tradition. An interesting one is Bahrain, which would qualify for my global free trade area, and it's because of its background. But it's in. Botswana's in, by the way. Chile's in, and it was, remember Bernardo O'Higgins? Again, Switzerland's in, but they set up their constitution based on the American one in 1789. So there are all kinds of funny reasons, and I wouldn't want to limit anybody, because the point is we want the world to adopt a more liberalized system so people do better everywhere. I think they're on to something, but I think we can broaden it with some vision. But I do think that the openness is a key factor, and that actually we ought to use the carrot and creativity a bit more than the stick.
Thanks, Dr. Halsman, for that very enlightening presentation, I think. I just want to remind you we have a reception. If you have any extra questions or something, it's actually over on that side. So feel free. Thanks for coming.